Everybody, welcome to the Fire Up with CJ show. I'm CJ Liu, and we are talking to Scott Swartzwelder from Duke University, and we are talking about the fully revised and updated fourth edition of Buzzed. And we're going to be talking about marijuana because I'm from Seattle, and now marijuana is it's legal here. And I thought before we all start smoking pot with reckless abandon, which I haven't done yet, nor I don't think I will plan to, but I figured we'd get some more information because we have a lot of teens out here. And one of the things that have happened with the teenagers around here is that they're, I think, experimenting a lot more with marijuana. And in fact, they're doing things like eating gummy bears. And we don't even know that they're eating, getting stoned with these gummy bears because they look like they're just eating gummy bears like regular children. So anyway, so I want to learn all about marijuana and find out about what it is, how it works, all the different versions of it out there. So let's start there. Tell us all about the varieties and strains and, some kind of things that we should be careful about if we choose to buy marijuana.
Well, I think one thing that's really important to understand is that although marijuana is one drug, as you suggest, there are many, many different strains, different ways to grow the plant, different genetic backgrounds of the various plants that get turned into medical grade or recreational grade marijuana. And so part of the problem always has been that you don't know what you're getting. Right? Mm-hmm. You don't know how potent it is. You don't know what it's been exposed to, and so on. And in a sense, the legalization movement is going to be part of the solution to that problem. Because the more it is monitored by the FDA, the more it is monitored by state agencies, the more it's controlled, essentially, the more we're going to know about what you're getting. So there's a certain level of quality control that's being introduced in places like Colorado and Washington that we don't have here in North Carolina because it's still fully illegal.
Right.
So associated with that point is that in part because it's been illegal for so long, cultivators of the plant have gotten very, very good at making very, very potent strains. Because the more potent you can make a plant, the less plant you have to grow and the less likely you are to get caught, right? Oh. So it's in the grower's best interest to grow as little material as possible to pack as much punch as possible.
Right.
So the big difference between the pot that's out and around now compared to the pot that was out and around when I was, in my late teens or early 20s, is that it's just the opportunities to get far more potent pot are far more plentiful now. So it's really an issue because if people can get really, really high and start feeling uncomfortable if they're smoking pot that's very, very highly concentrated THC. So that's an issue. That's an issue that we're going to get more and more control over in the coming years. But right now, it remains a problem.
But if it's regulated, don't the regulators in some ways do a quality test? Like I'm just now imagining the drug enforcement like, okay, yeah, that's okay. I would love it to be a drug tester in these state agencies. Because that's what they have to control, the level of THC in it, right?
Right. But what they would do, unfortunately or fortunately for them, is that they would just take a sample of it and measure the concentration of THC. They don't have to smoke it in order to
okay, right, because they can chemically look at it and figure out how intense it is. So the good news about being regulated in places like Washington and Colorado, and also in medical marijuana, which is a larger array of places, 30 different states have medical marijuana? Is that still the right number?
I think that's about right.
Yeah, so 30 different states have medical marijuana. So that means that whether in those places, at least it's being monitored, versus if it's illegal used for recreation, who knows? You're maybe smoking oregano or I don't even know what you're potentially smoking.
Right. Yeah, it's completely buyer beware if there's no regulation.
Okay, but now, and because I haven't, even though I live in Washington, I haven't necessarily gone and bought marijuana. Does it tell you the grade level strength? Because it tells you the percentage of alcohol when you're buying alcohol, or we start knowing what those are. Do they have that kind of information when you go to buy pot at a medical marijuana place, or I don't know? Have you gone to either Washington or Colorado to buy pot?
I have not, although I'm going up to. Is it legal now in Washington D.C.?
No. Was that a joke?
I think there was some kind of legislation. Maybe I'm thinking of handguns or something, right? But no, I have not. But I have read reports, and I keep up with the literature on that enough to know that yes, there are in some instances, in some dispensaries, very detailed information available about the particular product that's being purchased.
Yeah.
In terms of, the concentration of THC, the strain of the plant, things like that, all of which have an impact on the effect that it has in the brain.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that it is playing out that in fact having more regulation and oversight is resulting in more information. And of course, the more information you have about marijuana or anything else you put into your body, the better.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I don't know if I read this in an article here in our local paper, but they were talking about the kind of high you would get. So and almost like, how wines have like, it's an oaky flavor or it's kind of a sweet flavor, that they start kind of having descriptors around the marijuana that you get, so that you can kind of get a sense of what kind of high you would have. So, which to me is just fascinating, but why not? You do that with alcohol, right? So why wouldn't you do that with pot?
Well, and it's even more different with pot than with alcohol. Because alcohol, the drug is really basically the same, regardless of which vehicle you put it in, whether it's bourbon or tequila or beer or whatever. The alcohol is alcohol. Really, all you're getting is a difference in concentration, depending upon whether you drink, beer, wine, liquor, whatever.
Right.
Whereas with THC, different strains of the plant, the THC is actually different, and it's different enough to create a different kind of high, and create different kinetics. That is, how fast it gets into the bloodstream, how it moves around. Right. So there's a lot more variability across strains of pot than there is across, beverage types of alcohol-containing beverage.
That's interesting. But interesting. Okay, so one of the things that I saw when reading your book is they were talking about synthetic marijuana, which I can't even figure out what that could possibly be.
Yeah. Don't bother, because it's not really marijuana, and it's actually very dangerous, right? The so-called synthetic cannabinoids often are, they're cannabinoid analogs, right? They're chemically similar to THC, but they're different in some critically important ways that actually make them very dangerous.
And how are they different?
They're different in that largely because many of them, it turns out, have stimulant and or hallucinatory properties.
Oh my gosh, okay.
Yes, and they're really, really dangerous. There are a lot of kids that are showing up in ERs in psychotic states that are, and they don't, they're turning up negative on tox screens, right? Because there are no assays for these chemicals yet, right? And then you'll find out from a friend, he smoked some bath salts or whatever, right? And so this so-called synthetic marijuana, there we have no idea what's in them unless you take any particular sample. So and that stuff is dangerous. It's one of those things, from reading the book, there are just a few drugs that I kind of like put my hand down and go, okay, you should probably never do this, right? Like solvents and ecstasy, for example. I have to put synthetic marijuana into that category, at least for now, because it is not marijuana. It's something else, and we don't really know what it is.
Right. And in some ways, the takeaway that I got, you have a last chapter on addiction and such, but one of the key takeaways is anything that's mixed with something else, anything that's chemical-based, you don't know what the hell's in there, right?
That's right.
So take it with some caution, because you're just taking who knows what. You could be sniffing and drinking and consuming who knows what. Okay, so synthetic marijuana. Where do you even get synthetic marijuana? On the internet?
Well,
where do people even find this?
You can get it on the internet. Sometimes you can find it in head shops, because in many instances, since the drugs are just popping up new all the time, new variations on these chemical combinations, they're not even illegal. Nobody even knows about them.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so they're popping up on the street, on the internet. It's really, that to me is one of the more serious drug problems that we have these days, is that there's so many labs producing so many chemicals that it's really hard to keep track of.
Yeah.
And so safety is a real issue.
Yeah. Well, that would be, so I was I was actually looking at buying marijuana online, because when I was looking at all the popular search terms, and it was buying marijuana online, and I thought, who are these people? How could they be selling marijuana online? And how does one? I mean, what are those places? Do you know? I don't know, because I don't know if your research took you there, but where for these people that you were buying online? What are you buying, and what are those places?
I don't know. I haven't really studied that. I know about it in sort of the same sense that you do. But my bet is that that you're not buying pot online like that. That it's something else. I mean, unless internet commerce has gone to a place that I'm not aware of.
Well, I thought well, maybe that's where they're selling synthetics. I don't know what they're. I mean,
it probably is, because that's a lot of that. A lot of the non-illegal compounds, right, that nobody has any track of. A lot of that does turn up, and it turns up on, I suppose, probably like, through code language, and eBay and Craigslist and those places too.
Yeah. All right. So the other thing, and I don't know if this is the correct takeaway. So when I was reading your book, Buzz, The Straight Facts About the Most Used and Abused Drugs from Alcohol to Ecstasy, I walked away thinking, actually, pot's not that bad. When I compare it to heroin or cocaine or barbiturates, I thought it doesn't seem as bad. I don't know what's your. When I think about the potential effects and addiction effects and all these other things, it seems that pot seems relatively innocuous. Is that your takeaway too?
I would say I wouldn't say innocuous, but it's relatively less dangerous than those other drugs that you mentioned, and relatively less dangerous, in my opinion, than alcohol. That doesn't mean that it's not dangerous, and particularly for some people, okay? And it may be that for young people whose brains are still developing, that THC is quite a bad thing, right? That's where the research is going now. There's a lot of research being done right now on that topic. I've done some of it. The National Institute on Drug Abuse is making a major push toward trying to understand that issue of adolescent exposure and childhood exposure. And we just don't have all those answers yet.
Yeah.
But so I would say yes. If you want to just sort of create a simple continuum and say, okay, let's go from most dangerous to least dangerous recreational drug, right? Marijuana is going to be on the less dangerous side than things like, cocaine and heroin and ecstasy and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But again, that would be an oversimplification.
Okay,
right?
And you said that alcohol you'd actually put to the right of marijuana too, and if I get your line correctly, it's more dangerous than marijuana. Why is that?
Well, I think in part it's because, first of all, we know that alcohol causes brain damage. Okay, there's no good evidence yet that, at least if used during adulthood, that marijuana causes overt brain damage. Alcohol does, right? We know that alcohol markedly impairs individual's judgment. It markedly impairs motor function at high doses. So driving is a problem. Driving is also a problem on pot too. Yeah. But it's probably less potent in that regard. Marijuana is probably less potent than alcohol in terms of messing up those kinds of complicated brain functions that subserve successful driving and so forth. And then if you just look at the known social costs of alcohol, all of the destroyed relationships, the jobs lost, the crimes committed, all of that, the sexual assaults generated, all of the things that we know alcohol to be associated with which marijuana use in many instances is just not associated with those things, right? Violence, domestic violence, for example, is a great example of a real social problem that is absolutely tied in probably most, if not nearly all instances, to alcohol use. And marijuana just doesn't make people hostile. It tends to make people mellow.
Yeah, right. That makes them chill.
So it's like, it's like my students would say, I'd give this lecture about violence and violence and drugs and so forth, and they their response is, I mean, I've never seen anybody go in a bar, get into a fight because they were stoned,
Right.
Right? I mean, when's the last time you saw a stoned person pick a fight?
Yeah.
Right?
I actually think I've seen a couple of stone people driving here in Seattle.
Yeah.
I literally saw a woman. She's just sitting. We're sitting at the stoplight, and I'm like, and she's taking a toke. I'm like, is that a cigarette or is that a joint? I'm like, no, she's inhaling like it's a joint. And I thought that is just a brash thing, just sitting there at the stoplight smoking a joint. I was shocked. I mean, you don't see these things. I see these things. And then I was driving around 9 o'clock on a Friday, and either there were a whole bunch of old people or a bunch of seriously stoned people, because they were driving like at 10 miles per hour down the road. Like, if you're drunk, you're thinking you're pretty grandiose, and you're driving aggressively all over the road. If you're stoned, I think what happens is you drive really slowly, and because your perception, like you said in the book, because your perception of time is distorted, but then your motor function is also distorted, but I think in a different way than with alcohol.
Yeah. Well, and I also think that THC tends to make people a little bit self-conscious, a little bit paranoid, right?
Yeah.
And so you're unlike with alcohol, where you're disinhibited and I can do whatever I want, it'll be okay. People on pot, if anything, they tend to be a little bit over self-conscious, and they go, "Oh, I'm stoned. I think I'll slow down a little bit."
Right.
You know.
Not to say, and here's the thing, because I was thinking about pot and driving, because that's a big thing now, because with alcohol, we actually have breathalyzers, and we actually have kind of a rule of thumb. Like, if you have, like, I don't know what the rule of thumb is, but if I drink a glass of wine, I'm not going to drive for an hour or so after dinner. Or, you know, I'm going to drink in the beginning of dinner and wait till after dinner before I drive. But we don't really have those markers for pot, right? I mean, how do we know when it's okay? Is there a heuristic like that?
Yes, actually there is, and there is in Colorado, I believe, now a legal limit for driving for THC concentration. I don't know exactly what it is in nanograms per milliliter of blood or whatever, but part of the problem is there's no simple roadside test for it, right?
Right, like walking in a straight line. I mean, I could probably walk in a straight line and pretend I'm a ballerina while I'm stoned, right? I do all sorts of things.
You'd be far more able to do that on pot than on alcohol, but I also mean there's no breathalyzer analog.
I know. Yeah.
Right?
So how do you know?
The best way to do it is with right now anyway with the urinalysis, and that takes time. But to answer your question, yes, there is a range that has been associated with. That has been established as illegal for driving in Colorado, and I remember this because the very tragic case of the young man who was shot in Ferguson, and he was known to have marijuana in his system, and they did the toxicology and found that it was well above the level that would have been considered illegal to drive in Colorado, and which was a way of impugning him appropriately or not, but nonetheless that's the context in which I read about it last. So
it was
there
a
is
urine
rule.
test then. You have to urinate.
And in that instance, I'm sure in that young man's instance, it was a post-mortem test, so it was a blood test.
Yeah.
But it could be done in blood or urine.
Yeah, so what's a cop going to do? Hold on a second. Let me take. I guess I could do a simple blood test, but that seems. I can't imagine that when a cop comes over and like injects you and takes blood from you.
Yeah, that's getting pretty dicey. I don't think I could see that happening. I think it's more likely actually that we'll come up with ways of doing it transdermally, like with lasers and sensors.
Yeah.
So that in the same way that when you go in the hospital and they put that little thing on your thumb and it measures your oxygen, blood oxygen concentration.
Yeah.
Those things can be adapted in ways maybe in the future to put a little cuff on somebody and get a THC reading. But again, that's right now, that's science fiction. And the best rule of thumb, really, you said it perfectly about your own drinking, is that if you drink, you just don't drive for a while. If you smoke pot, just don't drive for a while, right?
So how long is like with alcohol, you kind of know, but I guess with pot, like whether you're like, I should drive or not. And if you're paranoid, you probably aren't going to drive anyways.
Right. Well, and of course the problem too with THC, it's a little more elusive than alcohol in the sense that you can get your THC level down But the metabolites of THC, some of them are also psychoactive. They don't make you feel high, but they still mess up your cognitive function. So
Oh.
even when you've stopped feeling high, you still have some cognitive deficits going on with
Oh.
THC.
Okay, so what would you say is the what would you do with your driving then? I guess just don't even drive. Just smoke pot at home. Don't drive around.
I would treat it the same way any responsible person treats alcohol, and that
Yeah.
is really, don't drink and drive, don't smoke and drive. I wouldn't do it. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
best advice.
Yeah.
And you got to use your judgment. I mean, if you're out at a party and you take a little tiny hit on a joint, and then 3 hours later you're going to drive home, that's probably fine.
Right.
But not if you smoke a big old blunt, and run
Right.
out and get into the car. That's
Right.
just dumb.
Blunt is a big thing stuffed pot stuffed
It's
in a cigar.
usually
Is
it's
that
like
what
a
it is?
hollowed out cigar, paper, and then stuffed or intermixed
With
with
marijuana. Oh my gosh, all these different terms. Okay, so what we have to say about driving then? What happens with driving with marijuana? So basically, what you said is that it impairs your ability to kind of. So what happens when you're driving and pot, and what is happening to you at that time so that you should be careful when you're driving, because you can't, like you said, you may not feel high, but it's still in your system, and THC
Yeah.
may be affecting you, and it's going to be affecting you in what way? Can you repeat what you said before?
Well, it's gonna slow your reaction times, first
Okay.
of all, which
Right.
you don't want when you're driving. It's going to decrease your ability to engage in multitasking kinds of cognitive functions. So, if you think about driving, it's actually a fairly complicated task.
Yeah.
You got to keep a number of balls in the air. You're sort of like remembering where you're going, paying attention for signals around you. You have to be able to react quickly, potentially.
Right.
You have to track, the conversation in the car next to you. So and THC decreases your ability to multitask because in part because it increases your distractibility, right? So
Right.
the typical stoned guys, just watching the cloud go by,
Right.
kind of thing. So for all of those reasons, I believe and I advise people, you just shouldn't be high when you're driving. It's
Right.
it's a risk. It's a risk for some different reasons than alcohol is a risk,
Yes.
but they're no less important.
This is why I think it now makes sense that when I was driving on that Saturday night, everyone was driving 10 miles per hour.
Right. I believe
Seriously,
it.
because if in fact what the key things are is that your response time and reactivity, and then your distractibility is really high,
Right.
and you're just going to be driving seriously slow, which is
Right.
what I think happens. Okay, so I want to go back to talking more about finding and using pot. So we talked about online stuff. We talked about dispensaries. And then there's all sorts of different ways of consuming marijuana. There's
Yeah.
teas, butters, oils, gummy bears, food. I'm sure they'll find, there'll be pasta with it. I mean, what? It kind of tastes like oregano, I assume. So you might as
Right.
well just put it in your pasta.
Well,
Carbs
yeah,
are
I mean,
good.
marijuana pesto maybe.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I think you may have just invented something new. So how should one? What are the differences of eating and congesting, vaporizing, smoking pot? What are the differences in consuming pot in those ways?
So there's one very simple and important categorical difference that's probably the most important one to understand, and that is if you take marijuana in through your lungs, it's going to be an entirely different experience than if you take it in through your stomach. Okay? So smoking it or vaping it is going to give you an entirely different experience than eating it will. Okay?
Right.
And that's because several things. One is when you take marijuana or any other drug for that matter in through your lungs, it gets to your brain very, very quickly.
Right.
Okay? And it gets into your blood, gets distributed through your blood very quickly, gets to your brain very quickly. And once it's in your blood so quickly, it means it starts getting metabolized and broken down
Okay.
right away. Okay?
Right.
So you tend to get a faster onset high, and it's gone quicker because the metabolic process gets started sooner, right? On the other hand, when you eat it, okay, and it doesn't matter if it's a gummy bear or a pesto bowl or whatever, right? That the onset is very, very slow, and so the experience is different. And people, experienced pot smokers who haven't eaten marijuana and then they eat it. Many of them don't like that experience because it feels like it never ends, right? So people eat marijuana and they go, "Oh man, this feels like tripping," right? But it's not because it's like LSD or mushrooms. It's because you're getting high over a long period of time and you stay high for a long period of time. That's not because the drug's different. It's just because of the absorption characteristics are different in the gut compared to the lungs. So that's an important distinction, and it's something that is really important for people to know, because if somebody eats some marijuana brownies or whatever and they go, "Oh, I'm just going to get high and I'll be high for an hour or two," right? Then they might get really freaked out when 3 hours later they're just really kind of peaking.
Oh my God! It could take 3 hours to get that out of your system.
Absolutely.
That's horrifying.
Particularly if you eat it and you've got other stuff in your stomach, right? Like you eat a meal. It's like with alcohol. You drink alcohol on a full stomach, you're going to get a lower BAC, blood alcohol concentration, than if you do it on an empty stomach, because there's nothing competing for the for the space to get absorbed through.
Right. So you kind of have to be careful with how you ingest it, because it will affect your experience. And if you're not wanting to experience it for 3 or 4 or longer hours, then maybe smoke or a vaporizer. And the other thing, it seemed like from the vaporizer, is that the carcinogens are less. Is that what I read?
Oh, the carcinogens are presumably reduced to zero.
When you so the whole cancer of the because I read someplace where you're like, is it about the same as nicotine, smoking pot versus smoking cigarettes? Tell us this. I can't remember what it said, so tell me this.
Well, in terms of cancer risk, the cancer risk is about the same in cigarette smokers and pot smokers, in the sense that per unit smoked. But pot smokers who don't smoke tobacco are far less likely to get lung cancer because they smoke far less, right? A cigarette smoker might be hitting on 10 or 20 cigarettes a day. A regular pot smoker, even if they're smoking a joint a day, is taking in far less smoke. Okay, so their risk is lower in that sense, but there are carcinogens in marijuana smoke. In fact, perhaps more carcinogens than in tobacco smoke, but because the amount smoked is so much less, because there are very few people that I know who smoke 10 or 20 joints a day, that the overall risk is lower. But as is the case with tobacco or with nicotine, if you smoke it in a vaporized format rather than a combusted format, a plant combustion format, I mean, the vaporizing systems, as far as we know, take out, this is complicated in the nicotine world. We can get to that if you want to. But the bottom line is yes. The answer to your question is yes. If you vaporize it, you are stripping out, presumably, most, if not all, of the carcinogens in the combusted smoke.
Yeah, because I was thinking, because some people, the medical uses of marijuana include cancer. So if you're dying of cancer and you're using marijuana for pain management, it seems crazy to then smoke and get cancer from smoking the cigarettes. Although I don't know how many you have to smoke in order to be, I know you have to be stoned in order to feel the pain benefits, but it seemed kind of like a counterintuitive thing. So those are the ways that people are ingesting it. Now, if you go to a medical facility, then I assume all these things are regulated, so they're all fine in terms of all of them are kind of equal. Is that true, or?
You mean equal in terms of the concentration of drug, or what? In
terms of safety.
Yeah. If you're like, for example, there's there are marijuana vaping systems, right, called Metapan or something like that is the one that I think of. And those are, they're all kind of the same. And they operate on a simple system of where you've got essentially, a liquid, concentrated THC load that then gets heated, but not up to the point of burning, right? Just enough to aerosolize off the THC molecules.
Right.
And then the battery heats up this little coil, the coil heats the thing. And I'm not sure in the marijuana preparations. I know in the nicotine e-cigarettes, it's put in a propylene, a dilute propylene glycol, right?
Yeah.
And that's what allows the nicotine to get aerosolized. I'm not sure what's used exactly in the vaping sticks for THC, but that's what happens now. So this is another one of these instances where the research is really just now being done on all this stuff because of the e-cigarette thing has become so popular. So we're going to know a lot more in a fairly short time. But right now, there are probably better and worse ways to vaporize these drugs. And some of them are going to turn out to be dangerous and others won't. And if the FDA does its job and facilitates the research and lets the public know which are the safe systems and which aren't, and then regulates those, we can be protected from that and have a system that's essentially pretty safe.
Yeah, I hope that they do that because, I mean, people, I mean, if I had cancer, I'd want to know which ones are safe and which ones aren't. Okay, so you were talking before about how long marijuana stays in your system, and you said it kind of depends. Like, it kind of depends on, you know, what you're eating. It depends on what's in your stomach. It probably depends, because there are people out there who either have a bad experience and they want it to stop. Like, they've, you know, they ate the pop brownie and 3 hours later they're like, oh my God, please let it stop. So first of all, let's address those people. Is there a way to get the buzz to stop if you're like, no?
No. I mean, once it's in there, it's in there. You know, now that said, I mean, the drug's going to be in there until it gets metabolized out. But there are things people can do to make themselves more comfortable, right? So if you're freaked out, you know, go to a place where you don't feel freaked out. You know, so get off the street. You know, get back home. You know, hang out with people you're comfortable with instead of in the bar with all the lights flashing and, you know, people you don't know. And you know, so there are like behavioral things that you can do to just manage your own anxiety. But you're not. There's nothing you can do to make that drug move out any faster.
Even working out, like, wouldn't that pump up your metabolism?
Well, it would, but it's not just metabolic. I mean, you just got to wait, you know, for these enzyme systems to kick in, and that's, you know, that's going to happen in its own time.
Yeah, and so one of the other things I noticed on the internet that people are asking are like, how long does it stay in your system? How long does it stay in your blood, your urine? And I think, you know, and I presume it's because these people are trying to take drug tests. And like, how long until, like, do I have to worry that they're going to pick up something?
Yeah. Well, so the good news about that is that it's, you know, it's very predictable. The bad news, and if you're trying to avoid a positive drug test, there are two pieces of bad news. One is that the metabolites of THC stay in your system for a very, very long time, okay? And it's the metabolites that those tests actually measure for.
Oh, gosh, okay.
And the other piece of bad news is that the tests that they use to measure those levels are extremely sensitive, okay? So they'll pick up trace amounts. The question that a person needs to ask is, what's the level, the concentration that my employer or my boss or my hospital or whatever is going to tag and say, okay, that's against our policy, okay? And that's set in different places, right? So if you're an air traffic controller, it's 0, right? But if you work in a typical, you know, school or hospital environment and you're not a neurosurgeon or something like that, you know, and you get randomly tested, you could have, you know, like 25 nanograms per deciliter or 50 nanograms per deciliter. So it'll be in there. But the question is, what level does the tester consider to be a violation of their rules?
But how long? Like, let's say I smoked pot freshman year. If I took a test, I assume it'd be gone. Like now, I mean, assuming I didn't smoke any pot since now it's freshman year, I assume that wouldn't show up? But like, what level of time has to pass between smoking and being able to detect one of those?
The rule of thumb is about 2 weeks to a month.
2 weeks to a month before that stuff gets out.
That's the rule of thumb, but that's going to be different. So for somebody, for example, who's a regular smoker or a user, their THC is going to stick around longer in them than it will in a naive user, right? Just for pharmacokinetic reasons, right? And so that makes a difference, and it makes a difference how much fat you have, right? Because THC and its metabolites sequester into fat. It's like, you know, my pharmacology professor in graduate school used to say, and he was kind of a heavy guy. He said, you know, I got more THC in my hips than you guys have ever smoked, right? So there are a lot of variables.
Yeah, no, I think I read a little chapter in your book about how someone lost weight and then they tested positive for pot that who knows when they smoked, right?
Right.
Okay, so other questions about safety, that going back to safety. So folks want to know, is marijuana addictive? And if so, what the withdrawal systems are? And like, could you actually overdose in marijuana or even possibly die? So let's take one at a time. So is it addictive?
It's yes and no. Okay, it's not addictive in the same way or to nearly the same degree that a drug like cocaine or heroin or nicotine or alcohol is addictive. Okay, but addiction is a complicated thing. It's a multifaceted disease. Okay, so there are different ways that we assess a person to determine whether they're addicted, and they can't have just one of them, right? So they got to be tolerant, they have to be physically dependent or show signs of dependency, they have to manifest craving, all these multifaceted kind of diagnostic category. And marijuana does result in a withdrawal syndrome. Okay, that's another part of the question, but it relates to this question.
Right.
Yes, if you're a regular smoker, you smoke frequently, or at high levels, even semi-frequently, and then you stop cold, you will have a mild withdrawal syndrome. By mild, I mean in comparison to those other kinds of drugs.
Right.
But it's unpleasant. So anytime you think about drug withdrawal, think about what the drug does when it's in you, and then just think about the opposite of that. And that's what the withdrawal will be like. Okay.
Okay. So if you're happy and calm when you're stoned, then you'll be unhappy and kind of excited.
You'll be like sleepless and anxious.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, which is not. Yeah, I mean, so if you think about it, it's a good rule of thumb. It's a good way to think about
any drug, whether it's pot or whatever. You're getting
correct.
And so, what are some of the typical withdrawal? I mean, that's for me. I get happy and slow, so I would get fast and anxious. But
yeah, I think, and by I would, if you probably wouldn't feel particularly fast, but you would be sleepless, right? So anxiety and sleep disturbance are the two hallmark characteristics of THC withdrawal. Right. And so in the sense that, so how does that help to answer your question about addiction? Well, if you're just thinking about it, if a drug is addictive, if it creates withdrawal when you stop it, then it's addictive in that sense. Right.
Right.
And to the extent that that withdrawal syndrome would motivate somebody to smoke again in order to treat the withdrawal syndrome, it facilitates their use. And so they'd be more likely to smoke more and more likely to become dependent, either, socially and psychologically and all those ways. So the answer to your question is, as I said, yes and no. Yeah. It depends on which characteristics, which symptoms of addiction you're talking about. There are very few people that have, overt craving for marijuana the way they do for cocaine or even alcohol. Where people will say, I need a drink.
Right. I need to go get a drink.
I need a drink. I got to have another hit on that crack pipe. There's not this sense of like, people don't pursue marijuana to the extent, in ways that threaten their relationships and their jobs and their personal safety so much, the way they do with some of these other drugs. So that's not to say that there's none of that, but there's just not nearly as much of it.
Right.
And so in that sense, marijuana is a less addictive drug, but that's not to say it's devoid of the capacity to produce physical dependence and a whole lot of other bad things in a person's life.
And you talked about tolerance as being one of the metrics. So if you smoke a lot of pot, I assume after a while it will take you, is it like drinking where you kind of like need more in order to get the same high?
It's interesting. Not so much. Not so much. In fact, if anything, a lot of people report the first few times they smoke pot, they don't really feel high. And it's till they kind of learn it a little bit that they start to feel what the high is. So if anything, that's kind of like a reverse tolerance thing, right?
Yeah.
But there are other effects that THC has to which we become tolerant. Like THC makes your heart beat faster. changes your blood pressure, right?
Mm.
And you do become tolerant to that, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes people, when they first start smoking pot, they go, "Oh, I don't like that. It makes me feel anxious and weird." And what they're really reporting is my blood pressure changed, right? And
Yeah.
and then if they keep smoking, they'll become tolerant to those physiological effects
Oh,
and
wow.
not tolerant to the brain effects. And so then they just don't feel that anxiety component of as much anymore. So it's really a complicated drug in that way. There are
Yeah.
tolerances that develop, but they're not unitary and they're not necessarily what you would expect.
But unhealthy too, right? I mean, you don't know that
Mm,
your blood, you're getting anxious, your blood pressure's been affected. You wouldn't even know,
absolutely.
right? You could
Yeah.
be having a heart attack and be like, "Chill, man, it's fine." You know?
Yeah.
Okay, what are some of the other physical effects aside from the heart rate and pupils dilate? What else happens when you? What are the other physical effects?
Well, I mean, those are really, in terms of the non-brain
Yeah.
mediated effects. Yeah, I mean, you get changes in blood pressure, you get changes in heart rate, you get changes in cardiac output.
Hmm.
Okay, so that your heart is beating more but less efficiently, that sort of
Hmm.
stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but it's obviously it's the brain
Yeah.
effects
Tell us about the
that
brain effects.
the brain effects are interesting because they're diffuse. There are receptors for cannabinoids all over our brains.
Hmm.
Okay, which in itself is an interesting question.
Hmm.
Like why are they there?
Yeah.
Uh,
Exactly.
but they're diffuse, and a lot of brain systems are affected, including the brain systems that motivate us. Right, the pleasure systems are
Right.
activated to some degree. But really, one of the systems in the brain that's affected very powerfully are the circuits that control learning and memory,
Mm.
right? And they're antagonized by
Hmm.
THC. It's
Hmm.
not good for them.
Mm.
And so your memory is really quite impaired
Mm.
when you're high. And your ability, as I was saying when we talked about driving, to engage in cognitively complex tasks, multitasking, multiple levels of processing. Those things are really compromised. And
Yeah.
so along with this sense of kind of quiescence and like being mellow, it's really the memory impairing and the cognitive impairing effects of THC that really stand out in
Right.
terms of the
But
brain.
that's when you're stoned. But even after you're stoned, does it affect your memory?
Oh
And
yeah,
okay.
yeah, and that's actually a really important question because um, I don't know if I don't even remember if I talked about it in the book, but the there was a famous study now back 20 years ago now
Mm.
where people took these airline pilots and put them in flight simulators
Hmm.
and got them to smoke pot in there and
Oh
then
no, I didn't read that.
engage in the flight simulator, which is a very, as you can imagine, extremely complicated cognitive
Yes.
task, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they had some guys were smoking active joints, some guys were smoking placebo joints, right? That
Right.
tasted like marijuana but didn't have any. And what they found was very interesting, and that is that, of course, everybody was impaired 15 minutes after, or 30 minutes after. Their performance was just terrible. But when they brought them back a day later, they were still impaired, even
Wow.
though they had stopped feeling high. 2 hours after they smoked, they were
Yeah.
still impaired at 24 hours. It wasn't until 48 hours after the smoking that
Wow.
they got back close to baseline, and then they were still a bit impaired compared to the controls.
Wow.
So even at 2 days out, now probably 45 hours since they felt anything like being high,
Right.
they're still cognitively impaired. So, and that's in part because the metabolites of THC, that is the chemicals that the THC is broken down into, they don't have the effect of making you feel high, but they still have similar effects that THC has on those
Oh
cognitive
wow.
functions.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about the research in your book that talks about teens and adolescents using pot, and I wanted to find out how they defined what ages defined adolescent, and then also the usage that they were monitoring in the studies.
Right. Well, at the ages that people usually think about as adolescents are really between about 10 and 24 now.
Oh, wow.
It used to be that people thought it was, 10 to 15, then it expanded to 18, then it went to 20, and now we really understand that the brain is continuing to develop, and very markedly so, into a person's mid-20s. Wow. And so adolescence might not be the best word to capture that interval, but that's the way I use it, and that's the way most of the people in the field use it.
Okay.
So, so when people look at the effects of THC during adolescence, it can be anywhere in there, right? It sort of depends on the study. And when people like me look at it in non-human models, where we can obviously get more control and do different kinds of experiments, we try to model a period that corresponds to mid to late adolescence, because that's really when people start using marijuana.
Right.
That said,
and what age is that when you're doing it? So is that like 13 to 21? Is that?
I think for me, the age is between 13 and 21, 22. Like the high school through college years to me are really the ones you want to try and capture. It's not a perfect science, obviously, and people measure different things, but it's pretty good.
Right.
So here are the bottom lines about it. First of all, when it comes to those memory impairing effects that I was talking about that are so characteristic of THC, such an important big side effect, if you will, those effects are far more prominent in adolescents than in adults. That is, it takes less marijuana to disrupt learning ability in adolescents than it does in adults. Okay. The other main feature of research that's been done, and the jury is still out on this, but it's worth mentioning because it's so potentially dangerous, is that for some people, and it's not clear exactly who from a genetic standpoint, but there is a certain subset of the population that if they smoke a lot of pot during those adolescent years, are placing themselves at risk later for serious psychological and psychiatric problems.
Wow.
Okay. That's not to say, marijuana makes people crazy, nothing like that. It's just that there may be a certain segment of the population that has a combination of genes that puts them at risk like that. So that's something to be aware of.
It's schizophrenia, or what were the different psychological?
It's schizophrenic-like symptoms, not so psychotic episodes, in other words, is what some kids that smoke a lot in their teen years seem to be putting themselves at risk for those kinds of problems later in life.
And what does smoking a lot mean?
That's a great question, because it's so relative. As we were saying before, you don't know what you're smoking half the time, right? How much THC's in it. So it's a very, very tricky question. But what I'm talking about is heavy in the sense of smoking every day, multiple times a day, pretty much every day. So I'm not talking about the casual marijuana kid who goes to a party in high school once a month and takes a hit on a joint. That's not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I'm talking about chronic daily users.
How can people who even smoke that much even have a job and be productive at all? I mean, if you're smoking 2 or 3 joints every day, I don't even know how you could get anything done.
I guess it depends on your job, in a sense.
I guess so. Okay, so this is talking about heavy usage, which is that you defined as 2 or 3 joints every day. And over what period of time?
Several years.
Okay.
And there are studies. I said earlier that there wasn't good evidence that smoking pot in adulthood resulted in any kind of overt brain damage or enduring cognitive dysfunction.
Right.
But that may be different for adolescents, right? There are a few studies out there, actually from a while back, that tracked people for a very long period of time. And I caught up with people like in their 40s to their 60s and tested them for cognitive function. And then they looked back and said, okay, well, how much pot did you smoke and when did you start? The people that had problems downstream later in their lives had all started quite early, like at 12, 13, 14 years of age, as opposed to people who started, after they were 20. None of them had problems later down the line. So it seems like even if they had smoked more starting in their 20s, they didn't have the problems that the folks who started early did. So that's why it makes me think, and makes those of us in the field think, there's something going on in the brain while it is still developing in those teen years that renders it vulnerable in a way that it stops being vulnerable 10 years later.
Right.
And so, it is very interesting. And I think it's a cautionary piece of data for people, because you look at that and go, look, and this is my kids. My son came to me one time when he was about 15 or 16 years old, and he said, "Dad, I know that I understand. I get the whole teen brain thing and the marijuana thing." And he said, I'm not using it, right? I don't like it." He said, but someday, if someday, I think it might be really cool, to smoke with you and your friends if you guys smoke ever.
Yeah.
Right? That kind of thing. And I thought, okay, that's great.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing. Not that everybody has to have that conversation with their
Right.
kid, but to send the message that, listen, it's, for better or worse, your brain is developing right now. You're at more risk than I am. I'm sorry, that's not fair. That's just what it is. But my advice to you, just wait a while. And
okay, I'm going to be your son, and I'll say, but all my friends, I just want to try it. I mean, you're telling me I shouldn't try it till I'm 24? At that point, I won't care anymore.
Right. No, that's a good point. And so my caution to him at that point would be, well, just be very careful about what you mean by try it, right? Because, one hit on a joint once in a while is probably not going to do any harm. But we don't know where the threshold is for starting to produce harm. So you just got to be really conservative about it. And, asking adolescents to be conservative is a losing battle.
Right. Well, even like once a month, like if I imagine myself in college smoking once a month, that would be a problem. Like, I don't know how I would even, I know it takes that a while for it to get out of your system, but that seems like a lot too. Maybe I'm being a prude, but I mean, it seems like that's a lot too.
I think the other way to look at that is that if you look at people who smoke, even if they don't smoke every day, if you have somebody like in college or whatever, even if they're smoking every 3 days, given that pilot study I told you about before, there's probably no time in the week that they're not impaired to some degree.
Right.
Because they're always on that back end curve with some degree of cognitive impairment. So even if you're just smoking every few days, you're probably at least low level impaired all the time.
Yeah, well, just think about, and this is the crazy thing, because what happens in college, right? I'm sure you're observing this on Friday night. People start drinking and smoking pot. That's Friday. So Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, you have a test. First of all, your learning is impaired during Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And then Monday, also, you're probably being affected, right?
Right. So that's exactly right.
So I get it. Okay. Any other things in terms of effects that people should know about in terms of smoking pot?
No, I think we've covered the really important ones.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. Fascinating.
Absolutely.
Fascinating. And I'm so glad that someone's doing more and more research on this. That's what we need.
Yeah.
Because pot's going to be legal at one point, I think.
Yeah, the dominoes have started to fall. It's going to be legal. And so we might as well figure out what it's doing.
Yes. Dr. Scott Swartzwelder, author of Buzz. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. I would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show, or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.